The Apple Turnover Gang, notorious for their bank robbing escapades across southern Dakota, had been laying low for a few months, licking their wounds from their last close call. But come June of 1885, the heat of greed had once again stirred within their 12 redneck souls, leading them to concoct their most audacious plan yet, to hit the Fishtail Sweep Reserve, the financial bastion that held the gold of half the state. Their names were as rough and tumble as their tactics: Big Billy Bob, Little Larry, Slim Jim, Fat Fred, Cletus McBride, Dusty Dan, Snake Eye Steve, Cousin Leroy, Hootin' Holly, Wild Willie, Cowboy Cow, and the twins, Jeb and Jethro Jenkins. They were a motley crew, each with a past as checkered as their shirts and a future as uncertain as the next sunrise. Their leader, Big Billy Bob, a man with a beard that could hide a small possum, had studied the layout of the bank with the meticulousness of a squirrel preparing for winter. His plan was simple yet foolproof, or so he thought: blow the vault door to smithereens, grab the loot, and ride into the sunset. The gang had been practicing their explosive skills at an abandoned silver mine, under the guise of mining for gold, but they were about to discover that the art of bank robbery was a tad more complex than they'd anticipated. Sheriff Robert Smith, a man as sharp as a tack and with a memory that could recall every face in a 5-state radius, had caught wind of their plot from an anonymous tip. He knew the Apple Turnover Gang's M.O. like the back of his hand, having chased them for years across dusty plains and through rocky ravines. This time, he decided, he would let them dance with fate a little longer, to build their confidence until it grew into the noose around their necks. He gathered his most trusted and stealthy posse, a group of lawmen who could ride a horse harder than a storm could blow. The day of the heist dawned as hot and still as a sleeping rattlesnake. The gang, dressed in their best bandit attire, mounted their horses and set off for Fishtail Sweep. As they approached the bank, their hearts raced like mustangs at the scent of water. They had all agreed to play it cool, to not get ahead of themselves, but the sight of the gleaming vault was like a siren's call, tempting them to abandon their cautious approach. The moment they stepped into the bank, the townsfolk knew something was amiss. The Apple Turnover Gang wasn't known for their subtlety. With a shout, they announced their intentions to the bank's patrons, who froze like rabbits in the headlights of an oncoming train. The teller, a young lady named Miss Flora, was trembling so badly she could barely count the money she was stuffing into the burlap sacks they tossed her way. Cletus McBride, the gang's explosives expert, approached the vault with a swagger that belied his inexperience. He'd never actually blown open a bank before, but he'd seen it done in a Wild West show once. He packed the dynamite into the lock, more than he thought necessary, and lit the fuse. The gang retreated to the safety of the alley, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground in anticipation. The explosion, when it came, was deafening. The ground trembled, windows shattered, and a cloud of dust billowed out into the street. For a moment, it looked like the apple turnover gang had finally met their match in the form of their own overzealousness. But when the dust cleared, the vault door was indeed open, though the surrounding walls had taken a significant beating. It was then that Sheriff Smith and his posse chose to make their dramatic entrance. They burst into the bank, guns blazing, and the gang barely had time to blink before they were staring down the barrels of the law's finest firearms. But Big Billy Bob was not a man to be caught without a trick up his sleeve. He had anticipated that the sheriff might get wind of their plan. And had set up a diversion, a string of firecrackers along the rooftops of the buildings opposite the bank. As the firecrackers exploded, sending a cacophony of noise and a shower of sparks into the air, the gang took their chance. They leaped onto their horses and galloped away, leaving the stunned sheriff and his men to navigate through the chaos. The chase was on. For 25 miles, the apple turnover gang raced across the prairie, the thunder of their hoofs echoing in the stillness of the early evening. They zigzagged through canyons, splashed across rivers, and dodged through patches of sagebrush, the sheriff's posse hot on their trail. Bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up puffs of dust and sending the occasional rock flying. But fortune, it seemed, was riding with the outlaws that day. Despite the sheriff's best efforts, they managed to stay just out of reach, their horses as swift as the wind. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, and the gang grew more daring with every mile that separated them from the law. They could almost taste the sweet victory of a successful heist. As night fell, the gang stumbled upon an abandoned farmhouse, the perfect place to lay low and count their ill-gotten gains. They dismounted their horses, chests heaving from the exertion of the chase, and stumbled inside, their eyes gleaming with greed as they saw the gold glinting in the moonlight. But their celebration was cut short when the floorboards creaked beneath them, revealing the hidden trapdoor that led to their doom. The sheriff and his men had been cleverer than the gang had given them credit for. They had anticipated their escape route and had laid a trap, waiting patiently for the right moment to spring it. The gang found themselves surrounded by a ring of lawmen, guns drawn and ready to end the chase. The standoff was tense, the silence thick as molasses. Then, Big Billy Bob, ever the smooth talker, spoke up. "Now, hold on just a darn minute, Sheriff," he drawled. "We ain't done nothing but what anyone in our shoes would do. We're just a bunch of hard-working fellas trying to make a living." Sheriff Smith's eyes narrowed. "You call robbing banks and terrifying innocent people making a living?" "Well, when you put it that way," Big Billy Bob said with a sly smile, "I reckon we're just a tad more entrepreneurial than most." The sheriff didn't find it funny. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up," he ordered. But Big Billy Bob had one more trick up his sleeve. With a roar, he grabbed a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag and threw it at the sheriff. The explosion rocked the farmhouse, sending splinters and debris flying. When the dust settled, the apple turnover gang had vanished into the night, leaving the sheriff and his men to pick up the pieces. The gold remained untouched, the gang's escape as elusive as a mirage on the prairie. The chase continued for months, the gang's legend growing with every failed capture. They became folk heroes of sorts, a reminder of the untamed spirit of the Wild West. But the law was relentless, and eventually, the apple turnover gang's luck ran out. One by one, they were brought to justice, their names etched into the annals of history as a cautionary tale of greed and folly. And though the gold remained lost, the story of their daring escape and the explosive misadventure at the Fishtail Sweep Bank became the stuff of legend, passed down from one generation of Southern Dakotans to the next. The town of Fishtail Sweep even held an annual festival to commemorate the day the apple turnover gang almost made off with their fortune, complete with a reenactment, apple turnovers, and a stern reminder from the local sheriff to always keep an eye on the size of the dynamite charge. The sun was a fiery crescent, dipping low in the western sky, as the apple turnover gang gathered their dusty horses at the outskirts of Fishtail Sweep. 12 redneck rascals with names like Rusty Nails, Cletus McCoy, and Billy Bob Butterfield, all mounted and ready, their eyes gleamed with the greed of gold. June of 1885 had brought with it a heat that seemed to bake the very earth beneath their hooves, a heat that mirrored the intensity of their plan to rob the most secure bank in southern Dakota, the Fishtail Sweep Reserve. Their leader, Big Jake Jensen, a man with a beard thick as a grizzly's pelt, had mapped out the heist with precision. Each member had a role. Each horse had been stolen from a lineage of the fastest steeds this side of the Mississippi. They approached the bank with the confidence of men who had done this dance before, who knew the steps by heart, and who had never felt the cold embrace of failure. Little did they know, the dance floor was rigged. Sheriff Robert Smith had been tipped off weeks ago by an anonymous telegram, the sender's name lost to the dust of the trail. He knew the apple turnover gang's M.O. They were more brawn than brains, and that's what made them so predictable. He had laid a clever trap, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to spring it. His plan was simple, let them do the hard work and then snatch victory from their grubby fingertips at the very last second. The bank vault was their prize, a hulking beast of metal and steel that stood proudly in the heart of the bank. It was said that the vault could withstand a tornado and laugh in the face of a Gatling gun. Big Jake, ever the optimist, had brought enough dynamite to blow the doors clean off the bank. They had underestimated the charge, not realizing the vault was a fortress meant to safeguard the town's riches from more than just a bunch of wayward bandits. As the fuse hissed like an angry rattlesnake, the gang's collective breath grew shallower. They watched the sparks dance down the fuse, their hearts pounding in anticipation. The explosion that followed was deafening, a thunderclap that sent the very earth trembling beneath them. The bank's facade crumbled, sending clouds of dust into the air like a giant had sneezed. The vault, however, remained steadfast, its door merely cracked, refusing to give way to the overzealous blast. It was then that Sheriff Robert Smith made his grand entrance, his badge glinting in the fading light as he stepped through the wreckage. His posse, a collection of hardened men with more grit than the desert sand, had the gang surrounded before they could even think to flee. The apple turnover gang had been caught in their own explosion, their plan as shattered as the bank's walls. But Big Jake was not a man to be caged easily. He had a wild card up his sleeve, a secret tunnel that led out of town. With a snarl and a spit, he shouted the order to retreat. The gang members leaped onto their horses and tore through the dusty streets of Fishtail Sweep, bullets whizzing by them like angry bees. The chase was on. 25 miles of heart-stopping gallops, jumps, and sharp turns. The gang had the head start, but the sheriff's posse had the determination of a pack of starving wolves. The landscape was a blur as they raced across the prairie, the wind whipping their faces like a furious lover's slap. Each member of the Apple Turnover gang had a story, a reason for their life of crime, and each had a vision of their future dancing in their heads, a future that now hung by a thread. One by one, the bandits fell, either to the relentless pursuit of the law or the treacherous terrain that had borne witness to countless chases before. Horses stumbled, riders fell, and the once proud gang dwindled to a handful of desperate souls. Big Jake's heart thundered in. His chest as he looked over his shoulder, the sheriff's horse gaining ground with every stride. In the end, it was a simple misstep that brought them down. Billy Bob Butterfield's horse caught its hoof on a hidden root, sending him and his steed tumbling into a ravine. The rest of the gang had no choice but to press on, leaving Billy Bob's cries to echo behind them. They didn't get far before the law had them in their sights again, the horizon swarming with dust as the posse closed in. The final stretch was a battle of wills, the gang pushing their horses to the brink of collapse, the sheriff's men doggedly in pursuit. The Apple Turnover gang had become the hunted, and the thrill of the chase had turned sour in their mouths. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the gang's escape grew as thin as the line between victory and defeat. In the end, it was the very thing they had sought to rob that proved their downfall. The explosion had brought down not just the bank's walls, but the illusion of their own invincibility. Sheriff Robert Smith, a man of honor and a master of strategy, had outsmarted them at every turn. As they were corralled into a box canyon with nowhere to run, the Apple Turnover gang knew that their days of freedom were numbered. The final showdown was swift and brutal. The gang members, their faces etched with fear and desperation, were no match for the seasoned lawmen. Big Jake, the last to fall, took a bullet to the shoulder. He lay there, the dust settling around him, as the sheriff approached, hand outstretched to help him up. "Looks like your goose is cooked, Jake," Sheriff Smith said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. Big Jake, with a grimace that could have curdled milk, spat a mouthful of blood and dirt. "I reckon it does, Sheriff." The Apple Turnover gang's tale of the fishtail sweep robbery would live on in infamy, a story of pride and greed that ended in a cloud of dust in the cold steel of the law. But as the gang members were led away in handcuffs, they couldn't help but wonder if their legend might still burn a little brighter than the fizzled embers of their grand scheme. For the people of Fishtail Sweep, the robbery was a close call, a reminder of the ever-present dangers of the Wild West. But in the end, it was also a story of triumph, of a sheriff who had outfoxed the most notorious gang in the state. And as the town rebuilt its bank and its sense of security, the whispers of the Apple Turnover gang's daring escape attempt grew into a legend that would be told around campfires for years to come.